No, yeah. They're trying to break the record to see how many people can leave California in 1 year. No, yeah, they're doing really well. They're doing really well. There's a lot of people leaving. They're leaving in droves. Everyone's going to Texas. Why are they going to Texas? Well, they're going to Texas because everything's bigger there. Everything's bigger in Texas. Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Today we're going to talk about the 50 states, or really the 50 science experiments. One of the misconceptions about the United States that even people that were born and raised in America don't really understand that well is that each of the states is supposed to be its own little semi-autonomous entity, going all the way back to the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution as we now know it existed. The states were thought of really more as like their own little countries rather than as part of one big country, which is the reason why it's called the United States of America and not just America. The states are supposed to be united really only on a few key areas: trade, diplomacy, war, and of course the Constitution. But the Constitution gives them broad powers. States can do all kinds of things. Anything non-enumerated in the Constitution is actually supposed to be reserved for the states. They're supposed to be basically their own little entities. Part of our system of federal self-government means that each of the states gets to decide, in theory at least, how they're run. The power of the states has slowly been eroded thanks to the expansion of the federal government. There's been two primary ways that the federal government has eroded the power of the states over time. One, the expansion of the executive branch through the creation of various kinds of regulatory agencies and bodies. And two, through Congress's control and manipulation of federal funding for various state projects via the power of the purse. Congress provides funds for various things like the Department of Education, like for road repairs, like for disasters and certain kinds of emergencies, and all kinds of stuff, prisons, etc. Research funding, for example. The way that they've been able to infringe, I would say, on a lot of the states' rights is through controlling the access to these funds. And so if you don't follow federal laws, you don't get access to these funds. This is why the drinking age, for example, is 21 across all 50 states. There's nothing in the Constitution that would allow necessarily for the federal government to regulate the drinking age, but they're able to do so by withholding funding for states that don't have that regulation in place. And because all the states are trying to get as much funding as they can from the federal government, they then comply with the federal regulations or federal stipulations for getting those funds. Now, this has huge implications for personal liberty, but more importantly, what it does over time is it causes a lot of centralization. It causes centralization and normalization across the contiguous United States and also the non-contiguous United States. And that's really not how it was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be this way. It's supposed to be that California decides how California is run, Alaska decides how Alaska is run, Michigan decides how Michigan is run, and they're all supposed to be different little laboratories for experimenting with different ways of governance. Now, of course, there's going to be free movement of people between the states, so you have free movement of people and capital and other things like that. Organizations can pick up and move states if they want, like when the Daily Wire moved from California over to Tennessee, or when Elon Musk just says, "Hey, I'm moving my companies from California base. I'm based out of California. I want to be based in Texas because I don't like the regulatory environment here. I don't like the tax environment, so on and so forth." And this is known as voting with your feet. So you're supposed to be able to pick up and move from one state to another if you don't like what's going on there, or if you just want to try something different. The problem with centralization, the problem with the federal government increasingly causing the states to be more the same across various kinds of dynamics, is that you're diminishing the diversity of the environments between states, right? So each state is supposed to be its own little experiment. They're each supposed to be experimenting with different laws and different rules. And of course, it's not just the mode of governance that's an experiment. It's necessarily this way because each state is going to be different. Each state is going to have its own culture, its own unique history, its own geography and natural resources and limitations where that's concerned. It's also going to have its own demography, the racial composition, the cultural composition, even the age composition of each state is a lot different from state to state. And so the person who's living in Wyoming, who maybe wants better job opportunities, let's say, should be able to go to New York and go find that. And the person who's living in California who wants lower taxes should be able to go to Texas and find that. But when the federal government is constantly making these stipulations and tying funds to them and using organizations like the FDA and the SEC and other kinds of, more or less government bodies that weren't really outlined in the Constitution, but that they create and then hand over to the executive branch. And usually they're doing this when when one of their presidents is in power, or at least when the majority party in Congress has a friendly president in power. They try to empower that executive, because if they can empower that executive through the creation of different kinds of federal agencies and different laws that apply to the regulations that those agencies impose, well, then they can get their agenda done in a way that sort of circumvents the usual legislative processes and requirements and protections that the Constitution might prevent them from doing. And so this overreach over time just keeps getting larger and larger and larger. And of course, what that means is that the experimental capacity, the way in which the states can each differentiate themselves and create new dynamics, and they're supposed to be competing for different kinds of citizens to come here, for different kinds of companies to come here. People get mad, for example, at Amazon for announcing that they're going to have a new headquarters and they're not really sure where it's going to be, and they're making each city compete to see who gets to win the bid, right, for the Amazon HQ. But the thing is, that's actually how our system is supposed to work. It's supposed to work that the businesses and people, the human capital and real capital and labor, goes to different kinds of states because they're looking for different kinds of dynamics. Now, I don't think that, for example, the exodus that's happening out of California right now is necessarily going to be the death of California. I think California is going to be just fine. In fact, they're still one of the largest economies. They're still the largest economy in the United States. If they were their own country, they would be one of the largest economies in the world just in that state. So California is going to be just fine. But the fact of the matter is that people should be allowed to go to Texas. People should be allowed to go to Florida. They should be allowed to, go out to Tennessee, go out to Michigan. And when they get there, they should be able to find something that's different from what they had before. Stick around to the end, because I'm going to tell you how we can start to solve this centralization problem. In order for this experiment to work, right? Imagine the United States is a gambler, right? And instead of you putting all your bets on one thing, one way of doing things, one political project or one ideology that you want to guide for how the country should work, you make 50 little bets. You reallocate. You're constantly changing and readjusting your allocation of capital, your portfolio, among these 50 different bets, depending on what's going on. And so through that method, you not only achieve a wide variety of wide diversity of outcomes and strategies and so forth, but you also hedge yourself against catastrophe. As the states become increasingly more normalized, and as power becomes more concentrated in the federal government, what you have over time is you have a decrease in the diversity of those bets in that portfolio. And that's going to eventually lead to an inherent fragility, an instability that's in case like a crisis, for example, like the coronavirus that hit us this past year, comes along, and it could wipe you out entirely. Now, of course, there are different trade-offs here, because a country that's more unified and more centralized can also coordinate itself more effectively, arguably, by having the same kind of rules and standards that apply across a large geographic area, that apply, throughout the entire system. Whereas, a country like the United States that's more fractious and divided, and you can't exactly just put one policy on from the federal level and have it apply everywhere the same, has some slight disadvantages in coordination, but they have the advantage of different kinds of strategies being employed and different kinds of methods and approaches to solving problems. And of course, the states over time begin to learn from each other. So maybe, if something's working really well in Colorado, the other states start looking around and they go, oh, hey, Colorado's trying out this thing. Maybe we should try that, whether it's prison reform or, dealing with the drug war, with marijuana legalization, for example. That's something that started out, on a state-by-state basis. Slowly, each state had their own method for example, legalizing marijuana, and different kinds of strategies for how to tax it to fund different schools or fund roads or even fund their prisons. And so each state got to do that on their own. And then other states started looking around. Hey, Colorado over there, they seem to be doing really well with that whole marijuana legalization thing. Maybe we might want to think about that. The states get to learn from each other what best to do and what not to do. And they can look around and they can see the mistakes and the successes of each other state and then change or adjust their policies accordingly. Last but not least, of course, is how we're going to fix this. I told you at the beginning of this video, I said, stick around to the end because I'm going to tell you how we can start to solve this centralization problem. And here's how you solve it. You solve the centralization problem through cryptocurrency. And the reason it would be through cryptocurrency is you can imagine every state, let's say, issuing their own cryptographic currency, right? A currency that's not tied to the US dollar. And the people who are living in that state, and even people not living in that state, could choose to invest in that network based on what that state's doing and that state's activity. And what this would do over time is it would remove the stranglehold that the federal government has on different states, which they do primarily through monetary policy and through funding through Congress, and allow actually individuals and even potentially people outside the United States, although I'm not sure if that would be ideal, to then invest in each state in a way that's uncorrelated with the United States dollar. So that's my thinking on how to reinvigorate the spirit of experimentation within the United States and get each state back to doing its own thing and decrease some of the centralization and normalization that's gone on in the last 200 years, really. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.